Welcome, welcome, welcome to our webinar. This, of course, is part of the series that AAC&U and CILMAR have been offering over this past year. I'm Dawn Michelle Whitehead, and I'm the Vice President of the Office of Global Citizenship for Campus, Community, and Careers at AAC&U, and we are so thankful to CILMAR for this collaboration. As I mentioned in all of our series webinars, our partnership began back in 2019 when CILMAR, under the leadership of Chris Atchison-Clare, convened a group to discuss professional development for interculturalists broadly defined. And this was a wonderful opportunity because it brought those that saw their work as focused on intercultural learning, intercultural competence, global learning, multicultural education, global education, intercultural communication, and diversity, equity, inclusion together. So we were able to come together to think about ways to collaborate and advance our collective fields. To those that this is the first webinar, and welcome back to those of you who have been joining us throughout this series. Again, for the newcomers, we often like to remind folks that this is a series based on the work of AAC&U's Value Initiative, but it's not a scoring webinar. We offer those, but this is meant to support the application of the rubrics in unique ways to improve teaching and learning. And as you will see, our next and final webinar will be on Tuesday, June 17th, and the topic is inquiring into personal and social responsibility. But without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our wonderful facilitators, and we'll get in on today's topic of checking in with the skill of intercultural communication. And I will turn it over to Kelsey and Basma to kick things off and give us a little introduction to themselves and their work. Kelsey, Basma, take it away.
Thanks, Dawn. Hello, everyone. I'm Kelsey Patton, and I'm an intercultural learning specialist with Purdue University's Center for Intercultural Learning Mentorship, Assessment, and Research.
And I'm Basma Ibrahim DeVries, and my full-time gig is as a professor in communication studies, just renamed, actually. We're rebranding. We're called strategic communication, but it just happened at Concordia University. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I do intercultural training and consulting as well.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited to be here with you today. So this is us together. We had just so much fun working on this webinar together. And today, our learning plan, we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into introductions and kind of add the communication frame to our introductions and an icebreaker as well. And then we'll dive into some of the conceptual and operational definitions using that value rubric about communication, verbal and nonverbal, and the theoretical frameworks as well. We'll do a couple experiential learning activities together on these communication skills, and then talk about assessment before we finish up. And we just also want to mention that throughout the webinar, please feel free to share in the chat questions you have, resources. So we definitely want to be answering questions along the way, and then any resources that you use and ways you might apply or adapt the tools that we're talking about today for the use in your own contexts. So after participating in today's webinar, our hope is that you'll be able to describe verbal and nonverbal communication skills, relevant contextual factors that influence an intercultural communication situation, identify tools and learning activities to facilitate the development of learners' intercultural, nonverbal, and verbal communication skills, and select tools and assessments for fostering and assessing intercultural communication skill development in the teaching and training context. So the capstone for verbal and nonverbal communication is to be able to articulate a complex understanding of cultural differences in verbal and nonverbal communication. For example, demonstrating understanding of the degree to which people use physical contact while communicating in different cultures, or use direct and indirect communication and explicit and implicit meanings. And the ability to skillfully negotiate a shared meaning and a shared understanding based on those differences. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and just dive into our frames. So communication gives us frames for how we show up in the world and how we encounter others and how we are encountered. So we just wanted to start with our frames. And there are frames that are more visible and frames that are less visible. So Basma and I, as we were just talking about what are some frames that influence the way that we communicate, we share that we're both women, we're working in higher education and university affiliated, middle class, and we're white. And Basma, would you like to add anything just about our frames?
Just that these are probably the things most of you knew as soon as you joined the Zoom room today. If you didn't know us previously, these would be some pretty safe bets, right? About the things that might inform how we identify and how we communicate. So yeah, great.
Thank you. Yeah. So these are our safe bets, right? And then we also wanted to share maybe some things in our frame that others may not readily see upon first encountering us. So we asked ourselves, what's in our frame that others may not see, and what filters might affect our communication interactions? So Basma, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah. And just as a point of reference too, in case there's a generational gap here, those can most of you maybe know what we're using strategically as a frame, but this is way back to when people used 35 millimeter cameras with actual film strip that came out negatives. And these are the actual frames that the slide negatives would be in if you watched an actual slideshow. Now, when we say slideshow, of course, we're talking about Google Slides or PowerPoint or something like that. But this is kind of old school to just represent the frame. So in my frame, I'm the daughter of Egyptian immigrant parents. I very much have two homes, one in Egypt, one here. And that informs so much of my upbringing. My parents came as adults. And so that also has an impact on how I see the world, how I am constantly trying to balance my multiple cultural dimensions and values. So part of that is I function on a polychronic time system. And I must say, I work with a lot of different people. Kelsey has been amazing in managing that. I can't even tell you how many times during our planning, I'm texting her, okay, 5 minutes, I'll be there. Don't worry, I'm logging in. And so I very much appreciate the adaptation with my co-facilitator and friend, Kelsey. And then something that people wouldn't really know unless I shared it, or unless you knew me for a while, or unless you saw me out in public, is I became a mother late in life, and my oldest son has Down syndrome, and that has shifted almost everything about how I see the world and how I do my work. It has had a huge impact. And so I share that with this group, just so you have an understanding of some of the ways that might come out in my communication and in what I perceive as important and when I choose to share or not share, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so my frames are that I grew up in the Midwest, and that informs a lot. I think growing up here, I didn't notice as much, but then when I moved around, I've lived in Pennsylvania and Texas as well, and suddenly I'm perceived in new ways. And so I recognized, I don't know if anyone has heard of the Midwest smile. There's this nonverbal communication act that if I was going on a walk around the neighborhood, if I passed someone, even if they're a stranger, I would give a small smile. I didn't typically show my teeth, and it would quickly go from smile to back down to just a resting face. So that was just something I learned, I think, implicitly growing up to always acknowledge the strangers around me. And there's other aspects of growing up in the Midwest that inform my communication style. In my family, I'm the daughter of service profession parents, so those who are on the front lines of service. So that informs a lot of maybe the questions that I ask or the way that I show up in the world. And then when it comes to pacing in communication and conversations with people I'm speaking to, I tend to be more of a pauser. So I'll wait for a pause before I speak, or a turn taker. So I might just wait to hear the period at the end of the sentence and then speak. And so that also informs how I'm perceived and how I generally communicate with others. So those are my frames.
Yeah. So as we encourage you all to think about what's in your frame, we're going to move to a little bit of an intro activity. And we want you to think back to your childhood, think about messages you heard or observed. Think of who's saying it, what they're saying, specifically about how you were expected to communicate. And this can be in different contexts, public, in the home, at the dinner table, at school, out in the shopping mall, wherever you went, out at the park, when meeting new people, when going to a place of worship. Think about what you were taught specifically, either verbally or non-verbally, was appropriate or inappropriate communication behavior, polite or impolite. So think specifically about something you were told or that you observed was strongly emphasized in terms of what you were expected to do, what's appropriate behavior or inappropriate, polite or impolite. And the way we would like to do this is in a minute, we will be taking the slides off the screen and having you think about that. We're going to ask some people to share out loud, to unmute yourself and share. And we're going to do this in the adapted Zoom fashion, thanks to COVID, having to figure out all the different interactive ways we do things. We're going to have everybody have their screen off, their video off. And I know some of you probably prefer to have it off anyway. And then we're going to ask that you, if you have something to share, you put it on, and we'll have one person share. And then when they share, if the one specific thing they shared was also a message that you heard growing up or something you were taught is either impolite, polite, appropriate, or inappropriate, please put your video on so we can see your face. And so that'll be a way that we will physically get a snapshot of what behaviors, what messaging was shared by the group and what things was not shared by the group. Okay. And then we'll ask somebody, the next person, to share after that. So we will take the video off now, or the slide off. So if everybody is willing, and I don't know if, could we unpin, who's in charge? Can we unpin us and just have the scene? Yeah. So this way we can have more people on the screen at one time. Is there somebody that has a behavior that they would like to share that they were taught was, and I'm going to recommend that everybody put it in gallery mode. So that little box on top where it says view, I forgot to do that myself. So now we can see people. And so those of you that choose to have your cameras off all the time anyway, if you would indicate with an emoji, if you are sharing the lived experience of the person that shared. Okay. So everyone will turn their cameras off. Who's going to be our first volunteer?
I can share.
Okay, whoever said that, you keep your camera on. The rest of us will turn our cameras off.
Oh,
and
turn
then
the camera on.
you keep yours on if you're sharing.
Okay,
Everyone
sure.
else will be off, and then we'll put everyone that shares the same experience that you're going to share, we'll put our cameras on. Okay? Okay,
sure.
Go ahead.
So I lived in different countries since I was like 2 years old. And one of the things that my parents always informed us is that whenever we pass something like the thing like paper or books or even chopsticks, we had to always use two hands to pass it to somebody who's older than us. So that was kind of the appropriate expression or appropriate way of communicating.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else have that same experience? You can put your camera on or do an emoji. A few people I see sharing that same experience. Great. And one thing that was a perfect first example. Your example could be a verbal or a nonverbal communication message about something specific. So thank you so much. Okay, everybody can turn cameras off. And who wants to share next? Go ahead, Arinder.
So not talking back to teachers at school was a rule.
Okay. I'm joining you there. Oh, look at that. Wow, popular one. Okay. And that says a lot. That simple behavior says a lot about many underlying values, right? Around that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's have somebody else share. We can turn our videos off. Erica, go ahead. There we go.
Sorry about that. I actually had to respond because my growing up was absolutely the opposite. We were told from early on that we were very smart and we had a voice and that we should question authority. And so from the earliest age, from kindergarten, I remember asking teachers, "Is that true? Can you give me evidence to support that?" And so that may make me absolutely unbearable as a conversation partner, certainly with a professor. But that whole notion of it's incumbent upon each of us to ask for more and to share what we know, to do it in a respectful way, but do it in an assertive way. So bad words were absolutely forbidden. And stupid was the worst of all the bad words. We were not allowed to ever use that word in discourse, but we were always encouraged to ask further questions of any figure of authority.
Okay. There was a lot in that, Erica. I feel like I could be half on and half off. When we do this live, we stand in a circle and we can walk partway in or partway back. So can you identify, is it safe
Question
to say
authority
that
would be the biggest thing.
question authority? Thank you. Okay, that's the thing. Those of you that share that lived experience of questioning authority. You can put your cameras on. Great. And one thing because you shared so much great information there, because if the thing was don't use bad words, never say stupid, mine would have been flashing, right? But the thing is, what we're seeing is multiple ways to interpret that message and what that means, right? And when is it appropriate to step in and ask a question or not? And are there any authorities that we should not ever question, like those in uniform, or and is that dependent on how we look and who we are and what our identity? I mean, there's so many layers, right? So for you, I see Erica very emphatically saying, for you, it was definitely use your voice, speak up, question authority. For many of us hearing that, there are layers to it, right? Where I agree this much, but yeah. So
and I recognize the privilege that goes into being able to say and do all of that. I fully recognize that sense of privilege.
That's a great point. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, it looks like Christina, would you like to share?
Definitely, I can't help it because so my point would be contradiction between what you are told to do and what you see your parents or close circle doing. Because I grew up in the communist Romania, so let's say you were told or taught not to question authority, but your family, your parents were questioning authority, and everybody was talking back in the small familiar circle. So yeah.
That's a great, yeah. So do you want it to be about the question authority example specifically, or do you want anyone to put their camera on who heard one message but observed something else?
The latter.
Okay. You were taught something specifically, but it wasn't followed by the people teaching you that message. Okay. That's
for whatever reason that was. Could be a communist regime, or I don't know, contradictions in the family, immigrant parents living in a different country.
Yeah. It reminds me of the common saying, practice what you preach, which is a common English saying, right? And so, but that's in a very different context, right? That's more about children's behavior in maybe more of a social context rather than the context you're maybe talking about. So yeah, great. Thank you for sharing that. Wow, the one first example has led to a lot of discussion. Let's have a couple more people just share an example about an appropriate or inappropriate polite or impolite behavior. Shelley, is your hand up?
Yeah, so for me, it's more about practices in my family. And dinner time was the time to engage in political and controversial discourse because we are a Caribbean family. And it was constantly about this is our time to have conversation and debate about social issues.
Great, thank you. So encouraging that kind of conversation at the dinner table.
Hmm.
Yeah, okay. And I think this is another one that's a matter of degree, right? So in my family, that was the case. But if we had guests over, right, there were a lot of rules about how much we might do that or not do that. So it's, yeah. Okay. Is there one more person that would like to share? Noha.
Hello, everyone. So for me, it's more of a behavior, or I should say like a body language. So when two people are talking, or like a group of people is talking, it is considered impolite in my culture to kind of cross in the midst of that group. So, and I still kind of feel uncomfortable now. For example, if two colleagues are sitting on, standing on each side of the hallway and talking to each other, I'm just like always like hesitating that I have to pass through and kind of try to find ways to go behind one of them.
Ah, yes. Okay. Good example. It's interesting because that's something you really made me think, Noha. That's something that I do, but I'm trying to remember how explicitly how I learned that, or how explicitly I was taught that, or where that came from. So that's a great example to get the wheels turning here.
Yeah, I remember my grandmother going, "Oh no, we don't go that way. We go this way," a few times till I learned.
Yeah, great.
So I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and so sort of in the South. And so in my family, commands were often phrased as questions. So, will you close the door meant shut the door, kid. Um,
So commands phrased as questions is the key
yes.
thing. Okay. That's really interesting, Mike. Thanks. Okay, we've got quite a few people sharing that one.
I have to say, my husband was raised in a very different atmosphere, and it drives him crazy that I am always asking him to do things when he knows he's being told to do something. And it's actually a source of constant discord.
Yes. Yeah, that's it's a great example of how something really quite simple, right? Think of all the other ways you communicate throughout the day with your husband, but this one thing, and I'm very aware that my own husband is in the Zoom right now. So he's got a list, I'm sure, of things that could come up, of things I do that are so annoying. But it's a great example of a one small behavior can have a really big impact, right? Yeah. Okay.
The quote in the chat of Midwestern background, do you think you might consider getting ready to do the dishes? That's very interesting.
That is great. That's great. Kelsey, did you want to share one, or are we good?
Well, I might just add with the question, sometimes it was, do you want to do this? Do you want to eat now? Do you want to go close the door? And that adds an interesting layer because taken at face value, maybe I don't want to, but recognizing, oh, I'm actually being asked to do something right now.
Yeah.
So we added want to that.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Well, what I want you to do next, we could go on and on. This could be fun. We could get all kinds of behaviors up, but we are going to continue on. And I would like you to think about just this little mini activity. And in the chat, if you could type in anything that you observe. What did you observe? What surprised you? And we will take a minute or two to talk about some underlying values, but just feel free to share in the chat anything that you observed about what was shared, about how many people shared similar experiences, and anything that surprised you. And it could even be maybe you thought about sharing something but chose not to, even be something in your own experience of it. So, Kelsey, do you want to highlight a few of the things in the chat for us?
The rules that we learn, even if we don't remember how we learned them.
Yeah.
Some of the experiences went beyond individual race or ethnicity.
Yeah, and that's such an important point. I think, part of my work has been in communication styles in the intercultural world, and I've worked with two colleagues very closely, Diane Hoffner-Sapphire, Barbara Kapler-Mick, on communication styles over the years. And that's one of the things that really motivated us to dive deeper into communication styles, was that most of the resources that were out there, like the little do's and don'ts in a particular culture, were very much tied to either a nationality, an ethnicity, a race. And we felt that that was really minimizing, that there's so many factors. We have a whole model of the different factors that motivate us to communicate in a certain way in different situations. And so, yeah, trying to train ourselves to stay a little bit away from making that assumption that there's definitely a connection, but also seeing that there are some generalized tendencies, and sometimes it is helpful to understand some of those generalized tendencies, and they can help us understand a lot of things going on out there in the world, right? And so, yeah, I could go on and on with examples on that, but yeah, other things to share from the chat, Chelsea?
Yeah,
Kelsey.
what's polite in one culture could be impolite in another culture, and vice versa.
Yes.
Just emphasis on shared experiences, even if we're growing up in different parts of the world. Surprised that eye contact was not addressed.
Yeah, that usually comes up right away when we do this activity. Yeah. Yeah. Great. There's so many great things in the chat, those of you that are scrolling through as well. And so I encourage you to think about some of the values that underlie these things, and which values might sort of transcend other values, right? So the comment about discussing politics at the dinner table. So for me, I grew up with parents who left their country to go to graduate school, and they very much encouraged dialogue and discussion and questions. Yet the Egyptian value on face and preservation of face, and the primary driving factor that family dignity overrides everything else in how we function in the world, has a huge impact on how I communicate. And so that transcends other rules in some situations, right? And so thinking about how different values kind of interplay and come into play in that situation is really important. And I love the comment also about, we don't always think of this, but many of these things are really the taken for granteds of culture. I think about how I did this activity once in a group. So I was working with a local nonprofit, and I was asked to come in and do a half-day training, a 4-hour training with their client services team. And there were about 18 to 20 members on their direct client services team. They were all part of this training. And when I was doing my pre-work with the leaders of the organization, they didn't say, we're bringing you in because we have specific problems or because we need to grow in this way. They just were interested in having a workshop on communication styles, thinking that might help things flow smoothly in their office and so on. So I wasn't there to sort of diagnose a problem or anything, but we were in the circle and we were doing this physically. We were at a beautiful retreat center. So the way it works physically is I would ask people to share, and they would move to the center of the circle, say their behavior, and then anyone who shared that same behavior would join them in the circle. We would take a minute to kind of look who's in, who's not. You could go partway in if you wanted to, and so on. And so it was lovely. I did it as an icebreaker, actually, just as an opener. And then at one point, somebody stepped in the middle of the circle and said, I was taught if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And Kelsey, maybe we could take the slide off for a minute and have people indicate on this in this group if that's a message you heard growing up. If you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. It's a very common phrase I think many people heard. And there was lots of animation and lots of energy in the room when I said it, or when this person stepped in and said it. And then somebody made the comment, look, everybody, we got everyone in the room. We're such a team. We got everyone in the middle circle. And I looked and I saw two participants not in the middle of the circle. They were the only non-white women. One was Korean American, one was from East India. And I, as a trainer, you have to be ready for this, right? So I decided to call it out. And at that moment, I knew that my agenda for the day was not probably going to happen, that we were going to go a different direction. And I said, not everyone. Remember to observe who's joining you in the middle and who's not. And they all kind of looked around, and there was a collective, audible knowing, oh, everything makes sense now. Those two women are the problem on our team, right? I mean, nobody said it that explicitly, but it was very clear. And initially, so there was some unpacking, took a lot longer with this whole thing than I had planned originally. But what came of it was a transformational moment for the organization and the team, which was we ended up circling around I gave the two women a chance to share about their experience. And what ended up coming out was, and this happened in Minnesota, Midwest, Kelsey talked a little bit about that earlier too. What came out was how conflict avoidant everyone else on the team was, how they skirt around things, how nobody would bring up something or address a problem more directly. And these two women would, and they weren't afraid to speak up. And for a moment, they were perceived as the problem. And if we just didn't have those two members of our group, we would be fine. But as soon as we started unpacking it and people saw the value in actually dealing with the problems and working through it, they became the heroes of the day. And so part of why I love this activity is that it helps surface some of those things. I was ready to go there, and I knew very well this would change my plan for the day if I was going to go there, right? But it ended up being a really good decision to really help surface that. So something you might think is really benign, really almost, harmless and surface. Oh, just don't say anything if you don't have anything nice to say, right? Really surfaced a lot for that particular team. So I share that just as a way to understand some of the layers and how it can lead to some differences. So, Kelsey, is there anything else that shows up in the chat here? And I want to invite anybody that saw a particular value attached to any of the behaviors that were shared that wants to share for a minute or two, and then we'll move on with our plan. If anyone wants to share, and Kelsey, if there's anything else you want to highlight as well from the chat.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of some resonance with culture shock. This was one of the culture shock I had moving to the US. Everything was nicely packaged, even when addressing problems. Current experiences, maybe that some of you are having, can resonate with this.
That's a great point. And it's also a great opportunity to share how the people that you were communicating with, Noha, with this culture shock, probably thought they were functioning at their highest and best by nicely packaging things to protect people, to not have things come up, right? And so often we all talk about intention versus impact, right? And so things are often very well intentioned, meant with the best of grace and openness, but definitely are experienced differently. Yeah. A couple hands are up. So Gloriana, if you want to share something, and then Christina.
No, mine is just a quick reaction to that comment, because I I'm originally from Costa Rica. I immigrated to the United States about 10 years ago. And my reaction to that comment is almost the opposite, because where I'm from, I think the hyper politeness and packaging everything in a nice way is even taken to like a whole other level. So when I came to the United States, I felt that everyone was extremely direct, and almost like sometimes I felt that it was rude a little bit in the way that things were approached. So I had to get used and adjust the way that I speak and the way that I interpret how others react, because it was not rude. It's just a little more direct. And then encountering other people, like my husband, he is German, even more direct. So I think that's interesting, depending on the background, how you interpret what nicely packaging commentary is.
Yes, that's a great point. And also where you start in the US and where you know, if you start in the South and then end up in New York, right?
Yep.
Versus New York, right? So the regional, and this is part of what motivated the work on communication styles, is even across, you know, you don't have to go very far to find some significant.
Very fair. And I ended up in Boston, so I think it was an awakening for sure. But yeah, that was my commentary.
Yeah. Christina, we'll take your comment and then I think we'll move on.
Thank you. I will just back up Gloriana's comment, because although I raised my hand before Gloriana, coincidentally, Gloriana, I was in Costa Rica last week, Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica, doing some trainings. And this was the main topic, one of the main topics. And this is common across Latin America. They are so indirect that every person coming from a direct communication background is bound to have problems in Latin America.
We're going to just move on to our theoretical frameworks before we head into some activities and assessments. Okay, so we just wanted to kind of give an overview of some of the theoretical frameworks that inform the skill of verbal and nonverbal communication. So there's many theories and models on this. We just picked a few to start with. And so some of you may be familiar if you've attended any of the past workshops, obviously not obligatory for this one, but you may just find this familiar from previous ones, is the Darla Deardorff's pyramid model of intercultural competence. So this webinar series has been over time. We started with attitudes, which Darla Deardorff indicated as kind of this foundational, what's necessary to start building upon in order to grow in intercultural competence. The word competence can invoke several different connotations, maybe an arrival point, but it's important to note here that there's not an arrival point with intercultural learning and competence. It's a dynamic model that we're constantly entering, using our skills, recognizing what we don't know, reevaluating, reappraising, and continuing to grow and learn in this space. So this model encompasses 5 elements, starting with those baseline attitudes, and then cognitive knowledge, so affective attitudes, cognitive knowledge, and then behavioral skills, finally leading to desired internal and external outcomes. So we began in the webinar series with attitudes of openness and curiosity, which lay the foundation for acquiring knowledge of cultural self-awareness and worldview frameworks, which ultimately lay the groundwork for practicing skills of empathy, which was our latest webinar, and now finally verbal and nonverbal communication. And so as you'll see, this is a pyramid model of building a foundation that is dynamic in nature and entering with an attitude, but you know, obviously within intercultural learning, there's so many experiences, new experiences that we're going to have, and these theories and models can inform our experiences. One framework that kind of comes from this is the Bloom learning domains theory, which indicates 3 learning domains. So those attitudes, that affective, foundational, finally the cognitive knowledge and building upon that to the behavioral, how we're showing up in our actions. And with this theory, there can be, the idea is that all the ABCs, so affective, behavioral, and cognitive, work together in order to grow intercultural competence, but that we can inadvertently overemphasize one over the other. So of course, you're familiar with these, in theory, if I know something, I should be able to do it, right? If I know the do's and don'ts of this cultural context I'm headed into, then I'll be able to just show up in the way that I know to. And that's not always the case. Our development is not linear all the time. And there are things that, these communicative messages we heard growing up are so ingrained in our frames. And many times I'll reflect on a past experience and say, I don't know why I did that. I completely forgot this knowledge that I had. So the cognitive kind of just went out the window in a moment when behaving. At the same time, with, I think, communication as a skill specifically, we can also overemphasize do's and don'ts. Just tell me what I need to do and I'll do it, without remembering the affective and the, behavioral side of things as well. So behavior doesn't always follow from knowledge and attitudes, and we just, needing to be careful that the knowledge doesn't lead to essentializing or generalizing culture in a way that's not actually allowing us to be effective in a new cultural context. And finally, we have one more theory from Stella Ting-To-Me, based on this is the mindful intercultural communication model. That skill, motivation, and knowledge leads to effective intercultural communicative situations, but that what the skill of communication entails is not just effectiveness that we might think. That I think that's a common word that's used with communication, but that in order to be effective in intercultural communication situations, that not only are these skills meant to be effective, but there's also different dimensions of appropriateness and also satisfactory ness as well. So effectiveness in a communication situation, Stella Ting-To-Me defines as this is our goals getting met as communicators. Are we getting the information we're looking for? And are we also effectively negotiating a shared meaning? Appropriateness is looking at, are we following cultural rules on a societal level in terms of politeness, as we've talked about in this webinar already, politeness and appropriateness. And finally, satisfactory. So this is the extent to which our identities are being validated in a communicative situation, and that our needs are being met in a communicative situation. So more than just are the goals being met, but that this is a more holistic way of looking at communication.
So we're going to talk specifically now about a theory that really talks about communication and actually connects very directly to many of the comments that have been made so far. So this is my favorite theory in the whole world, and that's not even an understatement or an overstatement. I love Edward Hall's high and low context theory. I think it explains so much. My husband, John, as I mentioned, is on the Zoom, and I think he would agree weekly or daily, something with this theory can explain the communication that happens in our home. But Edward Hall, essentially, as he was studying cultures, saw that it might be helpful to look at specifically how cultures organize themselves, and more specifically, where we are expected to find meaning. So his use of the word context is really about how much reliance on different layers of context do we have for meaning of a message? How much are we expected to look at different layers of context? And when we say context, that's a lot of things, right? So in my own work on communication styles, we identify 7 layers of context. So that includes the physical environment that you're in, And physical includes how comfortable is your chair, how many people are around, is it too hot or too cold, all those things. It includes the linguistic context, so what language are we functioning in? It's important to keep in mind that even if people are fully functioning in a particular language, in this case English, it may not be their first, second, or third language, and so some other things might be lost in that, right? Role and relationship context, there's all kinds of layers of context, right? One other one is constraints that could be there. So we're used to existing in this world now through technology. So there could be connection issues, there could be time zone issues. Some of you it might be late at night for some of you as you're joining this call. So different layers of context, right? So how much are we relying on the context for the meaning? Where are we supposed to look for the meaning? And everything we do in intercultural communication, almost everything, is continuous. It's on a continuum. It's not categorical. So even though these slides make it look like here's the list here for low, here's the list for high, please note this is a very long continuum. So both cultures could be anywhere on this continuum, have generalized tendencies as a culture to teach its members to kind of fall in a certain range, and individuals too. There's, of course, individual preferences. And then thinking about different factors that inform that. So lower context cultures have less reliance on context for meaning of the message. Less reliance on context means that most of the information must come in the message, in the actual words, right? So communication is more overt and explicit. Messages are plainly coded, verbalized details. Reactions can be on the surface because the information is all right there, just sent to you. I just said it all, you got it. You don't have to look at all the layers to get a lot of deeper meaning. Of course, context always matters, right? So this is a matter of degree, not an all or nothing. Context is always part of it, but our cultures teach us a generalized tendency towards how much we are supposed to look at context for meaning of the message, okay? And then what I love about this series, it goes beyond just the message itself, and it affects time. In lower context messages, time is usually more organized. We're used to sound bites. We're used to people getting a message out in a specific, compact way, right? And all of it's right there. There's emphasis on individualism in lower context cultures. And there's also more fluidity among groups. Lower context cultures tend to be more mobile cultures, not always, but there tends to be less of a really strengthened social network and social connectedness in terms of community. And so that individualism is highlighted, right? I always say that in mainstream US American culture, we tend to be lower context. I think somebody gave an example of a German relation in their life, somebody who, and Germans also have generalized tendency towards quite lower context, which is often more direct and so on. Although it's not a direct match, that higher context is always indirect and lower is direct, right? So there's layers to it. It's more nuanced than that. But I always say things like, I could lose my job as a professor with tenure and quite a bit of seniority over words I say in class, right? All those other things might not matter that much. Of course, there's a grievance process and there's all kinds of things written out in verbal, right? All the rules around how I could follow up in that. But technically I could lose my job over words I say. That would never be the case if I was teaching in Egypt, a much higher context, where some of those aspects of my identity and my culture would supersede, right? So my status, those kinds of things would, my seniority, who I know, my uncles at the university, whatever, right? All those things would be more important. The words would be less important, even if I said something that was considered offensive or unethical or whatever, right? So that's lower context cultures. And you see a couple examples there, right? So very specific rules about when to cross the street, laying it all out. All you have to do to find low context messages if you are in a low context environment. So if you're somewhere in the US or some other places, Northern Europe, some other places, open your freezer or go to the cabinet in your bathroom. All the little very simple instructions about exactly how you cook a pizza or exactly how to use this hair product and when not to use it. All the big warnings on things, those are very much low context messaging, right? Okay, and then we can move on to higher context communication, which is the other end of the spectrum. So this is again on a continuum, but messages are more implicit, more covert, sometimes more hidden. There's a lot more internalized understanding, more nonverbal coding, and nonverbal coding could mean as an individual interpersonally interacting, it could mean I'm using a lot of gestures or my face is saying a lot, or there's a lot of ways I'm actually communicating. But there are many ways that nonverbal coding happens in the environmental factors as well, right? So we have some higher context cultures that are highly gestural and animated. And you know, so many Middle Eastern cultures, for example, Italian culture, right? Generally generalized tendencies of using a lot of gestures, a lot of animation. But then we have many high context cultures that are much more subdued and where a lot of the meaning comes from some other factors. So many countries in Asia are higher context. Japan is a classic example, right? And so there's more emphasis on face, public image of the group. Time tends to be a little more open and flexible, although that's very context bound. Japan's a great example, right, of how time functions differently in different environments. You'd be hard pressed to find a train leaving 2 minutes late in Japan, right? But socially, maybe time is a little more open and flexible. More collectivistic, they tend to have more strengthened social networks. And then the groups tend to be more distinct. And often you can even tell group membership from a lot of visual cues as well. So that was a quick overview for those that are unfamiliar with the theory. And we have one more slide too that kind of shows you in some other ways. So this is for those that are very experienced using this theoretical framework. But it does this, I love this chart. I think it helps understand how this theory might come into play. And again, it looks like categories. Please know it's a big, long continuum. How decision processes happen, right? How this might play out in a work environment around work ethic and work style. How learning happens, how we approach learning, how we approach times of change. So there are many other ways that this theory kind of filters out. I find this theory revelatory in many situations where I hit a cultural bump. I can almost always find a way this theory helps me in some way understand that cultural bump. So we're going to jump into some activities to foster the skill of verbal and nonverbal communication. And I love this African proverb. And we joke in Minnesota, where I'm located now, that the mosquitoes are national bird. We have this beautiful lake country, but with the lakes come mosquitoes. So if you think you're too small to make a difference, you haven't spent a night with a mosquito. And that very beautifully explains our next tool that we're going to show you. We could spend the whole workshop on this. So we are, again, we wanted to share this tool with you, play around with it a little bit. But it's, again, one of those things, if you want to talk about a little more, there is a whole book where this tool is introduced along with the contextual factors and the model that I mentioned, and that's cited there. So just know this is a whole chapter in a book with every 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, everything having its own explanation, several pages with examples and so on, how to use it. So just know we're doing a little bit of an abbreviated version. But this tool was intended, Diane, Barbara, and I, when we were working on communication styles, we wanted to find a tool that could help people take that step back. So before jumping to conclusions, before jumping to an interpretation, before kind of just putting our frame of reference on something, we wanted to help people become more skilled at looking at verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors, figuring out how they connect to some underlying values or cultural dimensions, and really sort of pausing and questioning what other things might be going on here. How can I understand some meaning? Why is it that I experienced that guy? I picked up my mom's car for her at the car shop yesterday. And why did I experience that service provider as rude, right? So instead of saying rude, he was kind of rude with me. I felt like he wasn't, I don't know. Instead of doing that, how can I train myself to identify what behaviors, what specific words did he say? what was going on non-verbally that caused me in my own head and experience to experience him as rude. I don't think he was intending to come off that way, right? So this tool is intended to do that. This tool, by the way, started on an airline napkin as we were scribbled out. And what ended up getting published was the 14th revision of this tool. And I'm only sharing that because I want to impress upon you how difficult it is to speak about communication behaviors in a descriptive, neutral way. It's very hard to be neutral and not put an assessment or a value judgment on a communication behavior. And this tool is intended to help you do that. Even once it was published, we found several more words we would change, right? I'm sure there could be a 15th, 16th, and 17th edition, right? But we did our best to come up with some neutral language. And so there are 3 columns, there's 3 columns on the sheet, 3 more on the next sheet, but 3 categories for the descriptor checklist. So the first 2 columns under discernibles, these are things that you can pick up on if you are present if you are part of the communication situation, or if you're even observing people, either in a personal or professional setting. So things like, how did the conversation begin or end? What was the flow of ideas? What was the sequencing of information? How did turn taking happen? So that whole first column, things that you can usually pick up on if you use some careful observation skills. The middle column, these are all the nonverbals. If you had a textbook in front of you of basic communication, this is the chapter on nonverbal communication right here, right? So all the different channels of nonverbal communication. Somebody in the earlier exercise mentioned eye contact, gestures, all the vocal characteristics, those are considered nonverbal. The words you say are the verbal part, and everything you do with your voice is the nonverbal part of your voice, right? So how loud I speak, or how slowly I speak, or the tone of my voice and how much I vary my voice can have an impact on how you are experiencing me. And so those are the discernible characteristics. The next column are the discoverables. These take a little bit more sleuthing, but if you make some careful observations in the first 2 columns in the discernibles, you can pick up on some of these things. You can look at how meaning is created. Does it look like I am just in this moment kind of imposing information upon you, or are we co-creating meaning together? How is emotion happening? How are we managing emotions? How open is the conversation? Are the partners in the conversation to new ideas? How are we progressing through our discussion? So the discoverables can be discovered with some careful observation. If you think about the classic iceberg model, you can think about getting beneath the surface. We see this as like getting a peek into what might be below the surface and beginning to make some of those deeper connections. And then the third third category are the functional descriptors. So this is the second page. And the functional descriptors are the ones that are often in the linguistics world called speech acts. So these are the what's often called speech acts, like I said. So things like, is it an apology? Is this a situation of humor? And we all know cross-culturally, these are very tricky, right? Very tricky situations. So what I'd like to do is encourage you to click on the link in the chat and have the descriptor checklist in front of you. And we're going to watch a video clip from the movie Crazy Rich Asians. And if you are familiar with this movie, you probably could say a lot about it. It's an interesting intercultural movie. I think it was produced in 2018. It was based off of a book. But the main premise is that Rachel, who is a Chinese-born but U.S. American professor. She lives in New York. She's a professor of economics at NYU. And excuse me, and she travels with her fiance, Nick, or boyfriend at the time, I guess, during the movie. They moved to that. Nick is Singaporean. And what Rachel doesn't know until they go to Singapore is that Nick's family is very wealthy, very well established, very well known. And she is unaware that he is kind of considered like the most eligible bachelor there, and his family has very high standards for him. Rachel is perceived as very Americanized. And the scene we're going to watch is where Rachel and Nick's mother, Eleanor, excuse me, are playing mahjong with two other friends. Mahjong is a traditional game. And if you do understand how to play mahjong, there's many layers to this scene, even in how Rachel's playing mahjong. But what I'd like you to do is just look at the descriptor checklist. It's kind of overwhelming the first time you see it, so you might want to even just focus on a few things on the descriptor checklist, or one column or something. I recommend you use page 1, so the discernible or the discoverable categories, and just see what you notice about the communication between Rachel and Eleanor, who is Nick's mother, and just try to be descriptive in what you notice about what's going on in the situation. Okay, so we'll take a minute to watch this clip.
There is a Hokkien phrase, kakilang. It means our own kind of people. And you're not our own kind.
Because I'm not rich? Because I didn't go to a British boarding school, or I wasn't born into a wealthy family?
You're a foreigner, American, and all Americans think about is their own happiness.
Don't you want Nick to be happy?
It's an illusion. We understand how to build things that last, something you know nothing about.
You don't know me.
I know you're not what Nick needs.
Well, he proposed to me yesterday. He said he'd walk away from his family and from you for good. Don't worry, I turned him down.
Only a fool falls a winning hand.
There's no winning. You made sure of that. Because if Nick chose me, he would lose his family. And if he chose his family, he might spend the rest of his life resenting you.
So you chose for him?
I'm not leaving because I'm scared. Or because I think I'm not enough. Because maybe for the first time in my life, I know I am. I just love Nick so much. I don't want him to lose his mom again. So I just wanted you to know that one day, when he marries another lucky girl who is enough for you, and you're playing with your grandkids while the tanhuas are blooming and the birds are chirping, that it was because of me. A poor, raised by a single mother, low-class immigrant. Nobody.
Take a minute and look at the descriptor checklist. Yeah, and just as a side note, while people are kind of looking over the chart and thinking about it, Rachel, the fiance, the not fiance anymore, but she actually had, so in Mahjong, she discarded the I can't remember the name of the piece, but the double something, but she discarded the piece that she knew would allow Eleanor, the mother, to win. But Rachel actually had a stronger hand, but she sacrificed, right? And in doing so, she was kind of trying to make a point, right, to the mother. And there's so many ways we could write a 10-page paper on this, just that scene, right? But yeah. Comments about the communication between the two that you saw. Anybody want to share anything from the descriptor checklist? I see a comment. Both speakers seem to make eye contact at different points. It's not consistently held. Is this because of playing the game at the same time? That's a great point. So thank you for being very descriptive about what you observed about eye contact. And then your question is what helps us kind of go deeper, right? And get below the surface. So to use that one observation about how eye contact was used by different people can lead to so much understanding and meaning. My response to that would be that I think it was partly the game, but partly also saying a lot about how they perceived each other, about their relationship. I think Rachel was trying to prove to Eleanor some things about how she felt about her son and how her son felt about her as the mother, right? Sometimes the girlfriend knows more about how he perceives his mother than the mother knows, right? But the mother doesn't see that. So lots of ways that we can interpret that eye contact. Yeah, turn taking, another one. The slow volley back and forth. How power distance came up with that. The rate changed with the tone of the conversation. And that then can lead us to understanding a little more seriousness, a little more about the strategy that Rachel was using. The formal tone, almost in the beginning, it almost felt like the mother to me. So if we look at tone and experience it as more formal, more planful, then we can also lead to an understanding that, I experienced it a little bit like a lecture, right? And then there's things that's interpretive, right? And then how that leads to what the mother's trying to say about power, status, importance, all those things. Yeah. This is great. You guys, everybody gets an A for being descriptive right away. At least the ones I read so far. It is really tricky to not jump to conclusions, but many of you are including kind of an interpretation after noting what the observation was. And so there's a lot of ways that we can kind of use this tool in continuing to develop the skill of communication, and also in terms of really practicing ourselves and helping others become more skillful at adapting communication, at understanding communication. One thing I always say when we're talking about communication styles and our differences is it's never about I have to change for you or I have to adapt to your style. And it's not about matching styles. Match styles don't necessarily, and often don't, lead to smoother communication, right? It's about how can I remain authentically myself, but leverage my communication skill to achieve my goals, and as Kelsey noted earlier, be effective, appropriate, and satisfactory. And this clip was a really interesting way to see that strategy happening, leveraging, many of your comments lead to that, leveraging how Rachel communicated to sort of make a point to Nick's mom, right? So
our other activity is called How Would I Say That, or How Would I Communicate That? And so we just wanted to start, maybe we'll share it in the large group. I think that's a great idea, Basma. So what you would ask learners to do, or your teams to do, is just take a minute to reflect individually on how you'd communicate within a certain context. So there's on the activity, and we'll share this with you in the resources, there's multiple contexts. We chose just a few for this scenario. So what we might do is maybe share in chat or unmute, and how would you share regarding one of these examples on the slide here. So telling a family member you're not going to an important family holiday get together, giving feedback, or praise. We have a good comment in the chat from Emma. I feel I simply cannot answer any of these without knowing the catalyst and why for this situation to happen. Maybe I rely much more on context than I thought.
That's a great and you're welcome to put the context around it for yourself, right? So feel free to just put a situation in your head, a particular person even.
Maybe I can just give a quick example. So what I do with my students, I teach Italian. So when I give feedback, I would first praise all the points that were done well and why they were done well. I would express some feelings about how that makes me feel, you know, about their success, things like that. And then I would start, you know, picking out the points that could be improved and say how they can be improved and what would be effect of that and some kind of consequence. And I will say right away that this is definitely not how I was given feedback or how I was taught to give feedback. I am originally from Croatia. And as a matter of fact, that caused some problems when I came to this country because I would just be focusing on what needs improved right away. And there was an enormous pushback from my students. And so I had to learn a different way to give feedback.
Interesting. I know my colleagues in the education department talk about the compliment sandwich here in the Midwest. I don't know, that's a US American thing, but kind of what you were saying, and then also closing out with something positive as well before they walk away. So, yeah.
Yes, I was just going to say that for me, between say number 1 and number 4, it would be a lot more easier to praise a colleague, so saying something positive, than saying something negative to somebody. So it's like, how do I go around and around to say something? I'm originally from Latin America, maybe just has to do something with their culture, not going very direct to somebody. But when I have to praise somebody, it's okay. It's perfectly fine to be direct. I praise you, you did well. But when I have to say something negative, then that's not very easy. That doesn't come easy. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. That's interesting. And why it's interesting to think about why things don't come easily or why things feel more natural.
Yeah, that I don't know. Another thing that I could add about that, it's another thing that would be, and I know it's for some other people too, that it could be hard, is talking good about myself. So I can praise others, but it doesn't come as easy to say a lot of good things about myself or my work or
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this like a self congratulatory or how that comes off in different contexts. What are the social rules around that?
Exactly.
To communicate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in the chat, there's a couple references and key points. Erin Meyer's Culture Map book has there's a little section there about feedback and how it might be perceived differently in different cultures. And then also, I love the comment about how you might respond differently if you were doing it, you know, in the whatever the communication context was. If you were saying it, writing it face to face, it might even be different over the phone versus writing it a formal email, you know, how that would come out in different ways. So, yeah.
Right. Well,
and this is, I'll just say one more, this is kind of a fun activity. If you are working with teams or groups of students, where to kind of do in a role play, pull out of the hat, have two volunteers come up and, okay, you're the supervisor, give feedback or whatever, and then ask how might somebody else go about it differently, and have them come up and do it in a different way. And there's so many insights that come from seeing, there's so many assumptions that we make about how these different things should be done. And so it helps to just kind of see the different ways people might be thinking about approaching it. And then, of course, a deeper dialogue about what was part of that. So
I was just going to echo that idea of the other person and understanding what the other person sort of was thinking. I keep coming back to the idea of this communication being certainly about shared understanding, and you've mentioned that, but then also, I don't know, I guess how important it is the context of the other person as well. You know, that like my own experience is important, but then I think one of the things that I struggle with is picking up on those cues or understanding that when it's not stated or it's not obvious from the other side of that communication.
Yes, that's a great point. Whole nother session to keep going into that. But yes, that's an excellent point. Yeah, and some of those things you might know pieces of it, but we've all had those experiences, right? Where we maybe very carefully chose how we might communicate a certain thing in a certain situation, and then find out a whole bunch more context later, or the backstory. And sometimes that requires going back and communicating some more, right, about it. But yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of this is just bringing awareness to our own styles and an awareness of other styles. So that's why it's helpful, in these webinars, kind of, we can treat it as a community of practice and learn about other styles. And that kind of helps with strategies as far as like a meta communication type strategy in these contexts too. Like in Basma and I got to talk a lot about this too, as we were preparing for the webinar, is these are our frames, right? And so we were able to communicate about these using words, right? Like a little bit low context maybe in that way, and share some of our frames with one another, so that we didn't always have to, as Basma said, it didn't always have to match one another, but to know the context, or to practice some of those other foundational attitudes and skills of curiosity, or new questions that we know to ask now, maybe to understand someone's context even better.
If you want to do this on your own, I know we have a few other assessments we want to mention, but if it would be helpful, you're welcome to do this. Just thinking about verbal, nonverbal communication, intercultural interactions, thinking about your own communication experiences and preferences. So even thinking back to that first activity with messages, think about growing up, think about your own experiences. And I love to use the technique of a free write as an assessment tool, and then doing a little bit more with it after that. But just the free write rule is you put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, and we set a 2-minute timer, a 3-minute timer, and you just write. Nobody's going to collect it or grade it. No punctuation matters. Just write whatever comes to mind. It's sort of like getting everything that kind of came up for you in that context out. And then the follow-up would be on the next slide, where one idea, and I use this in class a lot, actually, at the end of classes sometimes. Go back after the timer goes off, go back and underline 3 to 4 keywords or phrases that just jump out at you, kind of read what you wrote in whatever kind of stream of consciousness way it came out, and then underline a few things, highlight a few things, and then really from that distill a significant insight that might have come from that experience. And so if any of you are on the fast track and want to share an insight, whether you're doing the free write piece of it or not, we welcome that in the chat, while Kelsey will show us some of the other assessment tools that could be used.
Yeah, so we'll again share all these resources with you, and we'll follow up. But some other activities that you might consider are role play, right? So it's not just about understanding, bringing self-awareness, but also practicing those skills. So a role play might be helpful. Class simulations, observational assignments, so going around campus or in public spaces and just observing. A video recording even, and watching it back. And watching video clips around like we showed as well, and then maybe even finding an artifact and analyzing it for culturally embedded aspects. So looking back at old emails you've sent, and looking at maybe the descriptor style checklist. And so those are some options there. And then another assessment tool that's been brought up in past presentations as well is the Asks to Plus. That is the Attitude, Skills, and Knowledge short scale from Holgate, Parker, and Callahan. And this is a self-report assessment. So you can have learners fill that out, and then we added some other examples of things you might include in the assessment as well. But just want to thank you all so much for your time today. This is so so informative and insightful and fun to learn alongside you. So we really enjoyed today.
Yes, thank you all very much.